Charles Hodge was a new side, old school Presbyterian, and he exemplified the best of those traditions. By new side Presbyterian, I mean that he modeled in his life the kind of piety and thinking that was characteristic of the American Presbyterianism in the late 18th century. He was raised by his mother, and because his father died when Charles was very young, and he said that his mother drilled him in Westminster Catechism. And therefore, he grew up in a home where the catechism was loved and enjoyed. He was pastored by one who schooled him in the catechism. And he had the kind of piety that modeled what we would think of as the First Great Awakening. So he was clearly a new side Presbyterian. But his main part of his career was in the 19th century, and he became one of the key leaders of old school Presbyterianism in the North. He's a professor, Princeton Theological Seminary, taught more students than any other professor in his era. He was the first theological professor to celebrate 50 years, a jubilee of teaching, and many students gathered to celebrate that with him after his 50 years. He became then involved in many different enterprises. He started the Biblical Repertory and Princeton Review. He was its editor and wrote many columns, many extending 50 pages or more, in which he explored virtually all matters of Presbyterianism. He also was a professor in the classroom, and he taught old school principles. He defended Calvinism. One of the features of my book, though, focuses on his 2-year hiatus in Germany. He believed that his training in America did not really prepare him for all the rigors of seminary teaching. So he was one of the first Presbyterians to go to study in Germany to buck up his knowledge of the biblical languages, to expose himself to the matters of biblical criticism and the growing liberalism of the German movement. And some scholars have said that this period was not very important to Hodge. After all, it was in 1826 to 1828. He's a young man. He is not in his prime of teaching. But I argue that this was an important time for Hodge. He exposed himself to ideas that were not part of his background. He strengthened his own skill in the languages so that he could keep ahead of his students, as every professor wants to do. He saw also the new model of theological education that was arising in Germany, what I call the Berlin model, in which the Athens model, which was the model that was being used in America, in which the training in spiritual life was foremost, as well as getting across Christian doctrine. The German model focused on careful theological study, careful, what was called scientific, Wissenschaft was the German term, careful discipline study. And also the preparation for ministry was to focus on the ministry as a profession. And Hodge saw that Germany was moving in a direction that was away from the classical Princeton model, as exemplified in what I discuss as the plan of the seminary. And so Hodge saw that the drift was moving away from classical theological instruction to become a technical study of the Bible, in which basic questions were raised about its authority, its authorship, the contents. And so therefore, Hodge knew that if he was to return to America, that this German model might clearly have an influence in America. And so he was determined that when he returned, Princeton would model scholarship. It would be rigorous. It would be thorough. But it would be orthodox. It would continue the tradition of Calvinism. So I argue that when Hodge exposed himself to German liberalism, German biblical criticism, he found himself in conversation with those with whom he didn't agree. and he could stand his own. And he was convinced that when he returned to America, that Calvinism could be defended, that the Reform view could make its way in the intellectual academy. So that's one of my emphases in the book. Another emphasis was on the journal articles that he wrote for the Biblical Review, the Princeton Review. And Hodge wasn't afraid to take on anything. Every July issue focused on the General Assembly, and Hodge always wrote about the major issues that were raised. But Hodge used the Princeton Review to put forth the Princeton view of things. I call it Princeton Looks at the World. There wasn't anything that they didn't take on in this Princeton Review. They, of course, took on theology, biblical literature, Presbyterian principles, the polity of the church. But they also took on science and literature. They also took on matters in the greater culture, so that it did broaden Princeton's view. It was Princeton's view of the world. And you could argue that as important as Harvard might have been, Yale might have been, that Princeton and Hodge's role in the Biblical Repertory and Theological Review presented the classical American view, Presbyterian view of the world and the culture. And he entered into all kinds of controversy. He was a major part of the moderate old school party. You had some new schoolers, you had very extreme old schooler, and Hodge and the Princeton men were in favor of certain biblical principles. They, with regard to, say, voluntary societies, with regard to abolition, with regard to cooperation with other denominations, Princeton forged its own view, and Hodge was responsible for speaking to all of these issues. And he took on the Southern Presbyterians as well, where they, old school thinkers in the South like Dabney and Thornwell, Hodge articulated a distinctive Northern old school view. Finally, Hodge was took on toward the latter part of his career the advances that were being made in modern science. One of his major works, for example, was his critique of Darwin. His book, What is Darwinism?, is still read by some as a very articulate defense of classical Christianity and a carefully modulated critique of Darwinism. And he was very clearly against Darwinism as a principle. He argued that Darwinism, because it lacked a sense of design and order, that Darwinism was essentially atheism. And Princeton had to deal with the rise of modern science and the studies that were being done in biology and animal studies. And so Hodge was responsible for that. And finally, Hodge became interested in the rise of a new philosophy of positivism. And he reviewed, one of his gifts to the church were reviews that were of what was coming out of Germany in terms of philosophy and scientific study. And he saw that the direction of science was in the direction of a very clear materialism, in which some of the classical features of Western Christianity were being avoided and even denied. And so he wrote against some of these trends, so that Hodge again exemplified Presbyterianism's educating ministers who would be true to the Word, carefully schooled in biblical studies, classical languages, but also had their eyes open to other features that were going on within the culture. And therefore, Hodge does represent the best of New Side Presbyterianism, the revivals that were taking place. He was converted at a revival in Princeton. And he represents the best of the old school Presbyterianism. He exemplified its